Hey there! Today we're diving into a powerful and transformative book, Brené Brown's Daring Greatly. This isn't just another self-help book. This is a wake-up call to live more authentically and courageously. Brené Brown takes us on a journey into the heart of vulnerability and shows us how it can be the source of our greatest strength. Have you ever felt that nagging fear of not being enough? Or maybe you've shied away from opportunities because the risk of failure or judgment felt too big. If so, you're not alone, and this is exactly where Daring Greatly comes in. Brown teaches us that vulnerability is not a weakness, but the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and true connection. It's about having the courage to show up, be seen, and embrace the imperfections of life. This book encourages us to let go of the armor we wear to protect ourselves from rejection and disappointment, and instead, dare to step into the arena of life wholeheartedly and unapologetically. So, if you're ready to explore how to live a life fueled by courage, resilience, and authenticity, stay tuned. In this video, we'll break down the key ideas from Daring Greatly and show you how vulnerability can lead to a more fulfilling, connected, and empowered life. Let's jump in. Introduction: My Adventures in the Arena. Before we dive into the core concepts of Daring Greatly, Brené Brown takes us on a personal journey in the introduction titled, My Adventures in the Arena. This is where she sets the stage for the powerful ideas that will follow ideas about vulnerability, courage, and what it means to truly show up in life. Brown begins by sharing her own experience as a researcher and storyteller. For years, she studied vulnerability, shame, and courage, but like many of us, she wasn't immune to these feelings herself. In fact, her own research led her to a significant moment of reckoning, a moment that made her realize that vulnerability wasn't just something she could study from afar. It was something she had to live, embrace, and navigate personally. She draws inspiration from a famous quote by President Theodore Roosevelt, which becomes the central metaphor for the entire book. It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. Who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. This quote struck a deep chord with Brown because it speaks directly to the experience of being vulnerable, of stepping into the arena of life with no guarantees, willing to risk failure, judgment, and discomfort for the sake of living authentically. The metaphor of daring greatly is about showing up in our lives, even when the outcome is uncertain, and giving it our all. It's about being courageous enough to be seen despite the fear of judgment or criticism. In this introduction, Brené Brown acknowledges the fear that comes with vulnerability. She admits that daring greatly isn't easy, it's uncomfortable, messy, and often painful. But it's also where the magic happens. It's where we find true connection, creativity, and growth. This, Brown believes, is the path to a wholehearted life. Brown doesn't sugarcoat the struggle of vulnerability. She admits that there were times when she, too, was reluctant to step into the arena. Like many of us, she felt safer staying on the sidelines where there was less risk. But through her research and personal experiences, she discovered that avoiding vulnerability only leads to disconnection, stagnation, and a life that feels smaller than it could be. She shares stories of how the lessons in vulnerability she was uncovering in her research began to seep into her personal life, pushing her to be more open, more authentic, and more courageous in her relationships and work. This transformation wasn't easy, but it was profound. In this introduction, Brené Brown invites all of us into the arena to take off the armor we wear to protect ourselves and to dare to be vulnerable. She challenges us to embrace the discomfort of uncertainty because it's only through vulnerability that we can experience true connection, joy, and fulfillment. So as we begin this journey through daring greatly, remember, this isn't about being perfect or fearless. It's about being brave enough to show up and be seen. It's about daring to live a life that's more honest, more connected, and more courageous than you ever thought possible. Let's step into the arena together and start the journey toward a more wholehearted life. Chapter 1, Scarcity, looking inside our culture of never enough. In Chapter 1 of Daring Greatly, Brené Brown begins by exploring one of the biggest barriers to vulnerability, scarcity. She argues that we live in a culture driven by the idea of never enough. No matter what we achieve, how hard we try, or how much we have, there always seems to be a sense that it's not enough. We're not smart enough, not successful enough, not attractive enough, not loved enough. The list goes on. This scarcity mindset affects us all in subtle and profound ways. From the moment we wake up often to thoughts like, I didn't get enough sleep, to the moment we go to bed thinking, I didn't get enough done, we're constantly feeling that we're falling short. And it's not just in our personal lives. This feeling of inadequacy seeps into our relationships, our work, and even our communities. Brown describes scarcity as the never enough problem, and she identifies 3 main causes behind it. Shame, the fear of not being worthy or good enough. Comparison, measuring ourselves against others and coming up short. Disengagement, pulling back and numbing ourselves to avoid the pain of vulnerability. Shame, she explains, is the voice in our heads that tells us we're not worthy of love, success, or belonging. It's the internal dialogue that makes us believe that if people really knew who we were, our flaws, insecurities, or mistakes, they would reject us. And because of this, we put up walls to protect ourselves from feeling vulnerable, even though those walls also keep out connection, love, and joy. Comparison only feeds the shame. We look around at others and see what they have, their success, their beauty, their happiness, and it amplifies the feeling that we're not measuring up. Social media, advertisements, and even everyday conversations can trigger these feelings of inadequacy, making us feel like we're constantly falling behind in some race we can't win. Finally, disengagement is the defense mechanism we often turn to when shame and comparison become too much. We pull back, numb ourselves with distractions, and avoid situations where we might feel vulnerable. But as Brown points out, disengagement comes with a cost. It prevents us from truly living and experiencing life to the fullest. The opposite of scarcity, wholeheartedness. But Brown doesn't just leave us there, she offers a path forward. The antidote to scarcity is what she calls wholeheartedness. People who live wholeheartedly cultivate a sense of worthiness from within. They don't buy into the myth that their value is determined by how much they have, how perfect they are, or how well they stack up against others. Instead, they embrace vulnerability, imperfection, and the belief that they are enough just as they are. Brown introduces the concept of living with a sense of enoughness, the belief that no matter what happens, we are enough. The shift from scarcity to wholeheartedness requires us to change how we talk to ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we engage with the world. It means moving from fear and comparison to courage and connection. She shares stories from her research where people who practice vulnerability and embrace their imperfections report feeling more connected, joyful, and alive. They acknowledge their fears but choose to show up anyway, knowing that vulnerability is the key to living a meaningful, authentic life. Breaking free from scarcity. So, how do we break free from the culture of scarcity? Brown encourages us to start by practicing gratitude. Gratitude, she explains, is the antidote to scarcity because it shifts our focus from what we lack to what we already have. When we consciously choose to appreciate the blessings in our lives, whether big or small, we begin to realize that we have more than enough. Next, she calls us to embrace vulnerability. Vulnerability isn't a weakness, but a strength. It's the willingness to take risks, to put ourselves out there, and to engage with life fully. Whether it's in our relationships, our careers, or our creative endeavors, vulnerability allows us to live more authentically and wholeheartedly. Brown emphasizes that this shift toward wholehearted living is not easy and requires practice. It's about showing up in the arena. As Roosevelt's quote suggests, and daring greatly, knowing that there will be setbacks and challenges along the way, but that the reward is a life filled with connection, purpose, and joy. So, in this first chapter of Daring Greatly, Brené Brown invites us to recognize the grip that scarcity has on our lives and to begin loosening that grip through gratitude, vulnerability, and the belief that we are enough. The journey toward wholehearted living starts here, and it's a path that leads to deeper connections with ourselves and others. Chapter 2, Debunking the Vulnerability Myths. As we move into Chapter 2 of Daring Greatly, Brené Brown tackles one of the most misunderstood concepts in our culture of vulnerability. For many of us, vulnerability feels like something to avoid at all costs, something that exposes us to the risk of failure, rejection, or judgment. But what if everything we've been taught about vulnerability is wrong? In this chapter, Brown unpacks the most common myths about vulnerability and shows us that embracing it is actually the key to living a more courageous, connected, and fulfilled life. Myth number 1, vulnerability is weakness. The first and most pervasive myth that Brown addresses is the belief that vulnerability is a sign of weakness. This is the myth that most of us have internalized over the years, whether from societal expectations, the media, or our own experiences. We're taught that showing vulnerability, whether it's through expressing our emotions, admitting mistakes, or asking for help, is a weakness that makes us look fragile or inadequate. Brown, however, flips this notion on its head. She argues that vulnerability is not weakness at all, it's courage. In fact, being vulnerable often requires incredible strength. It takes courage to put yourself out there, to face uncertainty, to say, I don't know, or to acknowledge that something is difficult for you. Vulnerability is about showing up fully, even when there are no guarantees of success or approval. Think about the last time you took a risk, opened up to someone, or pushed yourself out of your comfort zone. Did it feel weak, or did it feel brave? Brené Brown argues that it's these moments of vulnerability that are the greatest acts of courage because they expose us to the possibility of failure, but they also open us up to connection, growth, and authenticity. She shares powerful examples of vulnerability, from soldiers returning from war who express their emotional scars, to everyday people who take risks in love, creativity, or their careers. These examples remind us that vulnerability is the very definition of bravery. It's stepping into the arena and daring greatly. Myth number 2, I don't do vulnerability. The second myth Brown explores is the idea that some people just don't do vulnerability. That some of us are too tough, too self-sufficient, or too controlled to be vulnerable. It's easy to think of vulnerability as something that's optional, something that only sensitive or emotional people engage with. But the reality, Brown explains, is that vulnerability isn't a choice. It's part of being human. She points out that whether we admit it or not, we are all vulnerable. Vulnerability shows up in all aspects of our lives, whether it's when we apply for a job, fall in love, deal with loss, or even ask for help. It's impossible to go through life without experiencing moments of vulnerability because life itself is uncertain and unpredictable. Trying to avoid vulnerability only limits our ability to experience joy, connection, and purpose. In fact, Those who claim to avoid vulnerability are often the ones most affected by it. They may shield themselves behind walls of perfectionism, control, or indifference, but these walls also prevent them from living fully and authentically. Brown encourages us to let go of the myth that we can avoid vulnerability and instead embrace it as an inevitable and valuable part of life. Myth number 3, vulnerability is letting it all hang out. Next, Brown addresses another common misconception, the belief that being vulnerable means letting it all hang out, sharing everything with everyone, all the time. Many people think that vulnerability means oversharing or being overly emotional in every situation, but Brown is quick to clarify that this is not true vulnerability. True vulnerability is about sharing with the right people at the right time in a way that fosters connection and authenticity. It's not about dumping your entire life story on a stranger or airing all your struggles publicly. Vulnerability is about having the courage to be honest and open with the people who have earned your trust in a way that deepens your relationships. Brown emphasizes that boundaries are important when it comes to vulnerability. It's not about dumping your entire life story on a stranger or airing all your struggles publicly. Vulnerability is about having the courage to be honest and open with the people who have earned your trust in a way that deepens your relationships. Brown emphasizes that boundaries are important when it comes to vulnerability. It's okay to be selective about who you share your most vulnerable moments with. In fact, healthy vulnerability is built on trust and mutual respect. Brown encourages us to share our struggles with people who will respond with empathy and support, not judgment or indifference. Myth number 4, we can go it alone. Finally, Brown addresses the myth that we can handle life on our own, that we don't need others, and we can tough it out alone. This myth is rooted in the belief that asking for help or relying on others is a sign of weakness. But Brown argues that this couldn't be further from the truth. Human beings are wired for connection. We need support, love, and belonging to thrive. Vulnerability is the glue that holds relationships together because it allows us to be seen as we truly are. When we try to go it alone, we miss out on the deep connections that make life meaningful. Brown shares stories of people who have transformed their lives by letting go of the myth of self-sufficiency and embracing vulnerability in their relationships. She reminds us that asking for help, leaning on others, and admitting that we don't have all the answers are some of the most courageous acts we can perform. Embracing vulnerability is strength. By debunking these 4 myths, Brené Brown challenges us to rethink what it means to be vulnerable. Far from being a weakness, vulnerability is a powerful source of strength. It's the foundation of courage, empathy, and connection. By embracing vulnerability, we open ourselves up to a richer, more authentic life. In this chapter, Brown makes it clear that vulnerability isn't something to fear, it's something to embrace. Whether it's in our personal relationships, our work, or our creativity, being vulnerable allows us to take risks, grow, and experience deeper connections with others. It allows us to live wholeheartedly and dare greatly. So the next time you find yourself facing vulnerability, remember, it's not a sign of weakness. It's a courageous choice to show up, be seen, and engage with life fully. Chapter 3, Understanding and Combating Shame. In Chapter 3 of Daring Greatly, Brené Brown delves into one of the most pervasive and damaging emotions we experience, shame. Shame is often the shadow lurking behind our fears of vulnerability. It's the voice that tells us we are not good enough, that we are unworthy of love and connection. Brown defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. We've all felt shame at some point in our lives. It's that deep sense of inadequacy that washes over us when we make a mistake, fail at something important, or when we're rejected or criticized. Shame tells us that there's something inherently wrong with us, and because of that, we hide afraid to be seen or known by others. The difference between shame and guilt. One of the first things Brown does in this chapter is clarify the difference between shame and guilt. While the two are often confused, they are distinct emotions that impact us in different ways. Brown explains that guilt is a feeling related to behavior. It's when we recognize that we've done something wrong or made a mistake. Guilt says, I did something bad, but shame takes it a step further and says, I am bad. Guilt can be productive. It can motivate us to make amends, change our behavior, and learn from our mistakes. Shame, on the other hand, is deeply destructive because it attacks our sense of self-worth. It leads us to believe that we are fundamentally flawed, and it keeps us from showing up fully in our lives. Brown emphasizes that shame thrives in secrecy. The more we keep our shame hidden, the more power it has over us. But when we talk about our shame, when we bring it into the light and share it with others, its grip on us weakens. The shame web. Brown introduces the concept of the shame web, a tangled mess of conflicting expectations, pressures, and judgments that trap us in feelings of inadequacy. The shame web is made up of the different roles we play in life as parents, partners, workers, friends, or simply as members of society. Each of these roles comes with expectations, many of which are unrealistic or impossible to meet. For example, as a parent, you might feel shame when you can't live up to the expectation of being a perfect parent, when your children misbehave, or you lose your patience. As a professional, you might experience shame when you don't meet a career milestone or make a mistake at work. Society reinforces these feelings of shame by holding us to impossible standards, making us feel like we're never enough. The shame web is sticky and difficult to escape, but Brown argues that recognizing it for what it is, an unrealistic and harmful construct, is the first step toward breaking free from it. Shame resilience. The good news, Brown tells us, is that we can build shame resilience, the ability to recognize shame, confront it, and move through it in a healthy way. Building shame resilience requires 4 key practices. Recognizing shame and its triggers. The first step is simply to recognize when you're experiencing shame. Brown emphasizes that we need to get curious about our emotions and ask ourselves, what am I feeling right now and why? Practicing critical awareness. Once we recognize shame, we need to develop a critical awareness of what's triggering it. Often, shame comes from unrealistic expectations or societal pressures. By examining these triggers critically, we can start to see that these expectations are not only unfair, but they're also not a reflection of our worth. Reaching out. Shame thrives in secrecy, but it can't survive empathy. Brown encourages us to reach out to trusted friends or loved ones when we're feeling shame. By talking about our shame and receiving empathy in return, we can break its hold on us. Speaking shame. Finally, we need to find the courage to speak our shame out loud. This is often the hardest step because it requires us to be vulnerable. But when we share our shame stories with others, we rob shame of its power and open ourselves up to connection and healing. Brown shares powerful stories of people who have overcome shame by practicing these resilience skills. She emphasizes that shame doesn't disappear overnight, but with time and practice, we can learn to recognize it, confront it, and ultimately move past it. The importance of empathy. Empathy, according to Brown, is the antidote to shame. Empathy says, you're not alone. I've been there too. When we receive empathy from others, we realize that our struggles are part of the human experience, and we begin to let go of the shame that isolates us. In this chapter, Brown emphasizes the importance of creating a culture of empathy in our relationships, whether at home, at work, or in our communities. By offering and receiving empathy, we create an environment where vulnerability is welcomed and shame is diminished. It's through empathy that we build the courage to show up, be seen, and live authentically. Brown urges us to be more mindful of how we respond to others when they express vulnerability. Instead of reacting with judgment or indifference, she encourages us to listen, validate their feelings, and respond with compassion. This simple act of empathy can make all the difference in helping someone feel seen, understood, and accepted. Moving beyond shame. Chapter 3 of Daring Greatly reminds us that shame is a universal experience, but it doesn't have to control our lives. By practicing shame resilience and cultivating empathy, we can confront shame head-on and begin to heal. Brené Brown teaches us that vulnerability is not only the path to connection and courage, it's also the way to overcome the debilitating effects of shame. So the next time you feel the sting of shame, remember, you're not alone, and your worth is not determined by your mistakes or failures. Shame may tell you that you're unworthy, but vulnerability and empathy will remind you that you are enough just as you are. As we move forward in this journey through Daring Greatly, we'll continue to explore how embracing vulnerability and letting go of shame can lead to deeper connection, joy, and courage in every area of our lives. Chapter 4, The Vulnerability Armory. In Chapter 4 of Daring Greatly, Brené Brown introduces us to what she calls the vulnerability Armory, the defenses we build around ourselves to protect us from the discomfort of vulnerability. While these strategies may offer a sense of safety in the short term, they ultimately prevent us from being truly seen and from living wholeheartedly. Brown explains that vulnerability, while scary, is essential to forming deep connections, taking risks, and living authentically. However, most of us have developed protective strategies, or armor, that we use to guard ourselves from the emotional exposure vulnerability requires. Let's explore these common forms of armor and how they keep us from living fully. Armor number 1, foreboding joy. One of the most common forms of vulnerability armor is what Brené Brown calls foreboding joy. This happens when, instead of allowing ourselves to fully experience joy and happiness, we immediately start to worry about when it will be taken away. It's the feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop when things are going well. Brown shares a poignant example. Imagine a parent standing over their sleeping child, feeling overwhelmed with love and gratitude, but then suddenly being struck by thoughts of all the terrible things that could happen. Instead of fully embracing that moment of joy, fear and anxiety creep in, blocking the positive experience. This is foreboding joy. Foreboding joy is a defense mechanism. We don't want to be caught off guard by pain or loss, so we dampen our own joy in anticipation of potential hurt. But as Brown explains, when we do this, we rob ourselves of the ability to fully experience life's beautiful moments. We keep ourselves from fully leaning into joy because we're trying to shield ourselves from vulnerability. To break free from foreboding joy, Brown encourages us to practice gratitude. When we start to feel the weight of fear taking over our joyful moments, we can consciously shift our focus to gratitude, acknowledging what we have rather than fearing what could be lost. Gratitude helps ground us in the present and allows us to savor joy without letting fear steal the moment. Armor number 2, perfectionism. Another powerful piece of armor many of us wear is perfectionism. Brown points out that perfectionism is not the same as striving for excellence. While striving for excellence is about setting high standards and working hard, perfectionism is rooted in the belief that if we can just do things perfectly, we can avoid judgment, shame, and failure. At its core, perfectionism is a defense mechanism against vulnerability. We believe that if we present ourselves as flawless, we can protect ourselves from criticism or rejection. But as Brown explains, perfectionism doesn't protect us. It actually keeps us from being seen for who we really are. It keeps us locked in a cycle of trying to meet impossible standards, leaving us feeling exhausted and disconnected. Perfectionism also makes it difficult to take risks because the fear of failure or making mistakes is so overwhelming. This prevents us from embracing new opportunities or engaging in creative endeavors, areas where vulnerability is essential for growth. Brown suggests that the antidote to perfectionism is self-compassion. Instead of striving for perfection, we should strive to be kind to ourselves, accept our imperfections, and understand that mistakes are part of being human. By practicing self-compassion, we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, knowing that our worth isn't determined by how perfectly we perform. Armor number 3, numbing. One of the most common strategies we use to avoid vulnerability is numbing. When we feel overwhelmed by shame, fear, or discomfort, many of us turn to numbing behaviors to escape the pain. These behaviors can take many forms, from binge-watching TV, compulsively scrolling through social media, overeating, or even more destructive habits like substance abuse. Brown explains that numbing is not selective. When we numb our negative emotions, we also numb our positive ones. This means that by avoiding vulnerability and trying to shield ourselves from pain, we also end up cutting ourselves off from joy, connection, and meaning. The key to breaking free from numbing, according to Brown, is to lean into discomfort rather than trying to escape it. This doesn't mean seeking out pain or discomfort for its own sake, but rather allowing ourselves to sit with difficult emotions without trying to block them out. By acknowledging our feelings and choosing to face them head on, we build emotional resilience and foster greater vulnerability. Brown also emphasizes the importance of self-care and balance. Numbing often happens when we're burned out and overstressed, so practicing healthy self-care routines can help us stay grounded and present rather than turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms. The cost of armor. The problem with this vulnerability armor, Brown explains, is that while it might make us feel safer in the short term, it comes at a cost. When we armor up, we disconnect from others, from ourselves, and from the experiences that make life rich and meaningful. We might avoid feeling pain, but we also miss out on joy, love, and connection. Brown's research shows that vulnerability is the birthplace of creativity, love, and innovation. When we hide behind perfectionism, numbing, or foreboding joy, we're not truly living, we're just surviving. We might avoid the risks of failure or judgment, but we also prevent ourselves from taking the bold, courageous actions that could lead to real growth and fulfillment. Removing the armor. So, how do we begin to remove this armor and embrace vulnerability? Brown suggests that it starts with self-awareness, noticing when and why we put on our armor and how it's affecting us. The next step is to practice self-compassion, giving ourselves permission to be imperfect and vulnerable without judgment. Brown also encourages us to replace our armor with healthy, productive strategies, like practicing gratitude when we feel foreboding joy, leaning into discomfort instead of numbing, and embracing our humanity instead of striving for perfection. These small shifts can help us stay open, authentic, and connected, even when vulnerability feels difficult. In this chapter, Brené Brown reminds us that vulnerability is not the enemy, our defenses against it are. By choosing courage over comfort, we allow ourselves to fully engage with life, embracing both its highs and its lows with an open heart. Chapter 5, Mind the Gap, Cultivating Change and Closing the Disengagement Divide. In Chapter 5 of Daring Greatly, Brené Brown shifts the focus to an important issue that affects both our personal lives and our culture at large, the gap between the values we claim to uphold and the actions we actually take. Brown calls this the disengagement divide, the space between our words and our deeds, between our intentions and our reality. It's in this gap that disengagement, disconnection, and dissatisfaction thrive. We've all experienced this divide. Maybe we claim that we value honesty, yet find ourselves avoiding tough conversations. Or perhaps we believe in the importance of work-life balance, yet consistently overextend ourselves at work, sacrificing time with loved ones. The larger this gap becomes, the more disconnected we feel from our true selves and the people around us. The core of this chapter is about cultivating alignment between our values and our actions, closing the gap so that we can live more authentically, wholeheartedly, and in alignment with what we truly believe in. Living our values versus talking about our values. Brown begins by explaining that many of us struggle with the discrepancy between what we believe and how we behave. We may talk about living by our values, but when it comes to taking action, we sometimes fall short. This isn't necessarily because we're dishonest or insincere. It's often because living in alignment with our values requires vulnerability and courage, and that can be difficult. For example, Brown points out that many organizations talk about fostering creativity, innovation, and transparency. However, in practice, they may inadvertently stifle these values by promoting fear, perfectionism, or a culture of scarcity. The same is true in our personal lives. We might believe in the importance of connection and compassion, but avoid difficult conversations out of fear of conflict or rejection. The gap between talking about our values and living them creates disengagement and disconnection, not just with others, but with ourselves. This gap is where shame, guilt, and dissatisfaction can thrive, leading us to feel as though we're not living up to our own standards. Understanding disengagement. One of the key reasons why this gap exists, according to Brown, is disengagement. When we feel disconnected from our work, our relationships, or our sense of purpose, we often disengage as a way to protect ourselves. Disengagement can take many forms: avoiding difficult conversations, shutting down emotionally, withdrawing from social situations, or even numbing ourselves with distractions. Brown argues that disengagement is often a defense mechanism. We disengage because we're afraid of failing, being judged, or feeling vulnerable. But ironically, disengagement only increases our feelings of dissatisfaction and disconnects us further from the very values we want to live by. The power of accountability and feedback. So how do we close this gap and cultivate change? One of the most important steps, according to Brown, is embracing accountability. Accountability involves being willing to take responsibility for our actions, being open to feedback, and holding ourselves and others to the values we claim to live by. This doesn't mean harsh self-criticism or judgment. Instead, it's about being honest with ourselves about where we're falling short and where we need to grow. Brown explains that one of the most courageous things we can do is to seek out feedback from people we trust and respect. This kind of feedback helps us identify where our actions may not be aligning with our values and gives us the opportunity to make changes. Accountability is about integrity, ensuring that our behaviors reflect the values we hold dear. Whether it's in our relationships, our work, or our communities, accountability helps us stay on track, grow, and live more authentically. Closing the disengagement divide. Brown also emphasizes the importance of vulnerability in closing the disengagement divide. Vulnerability allows us to show up honestly, admit our mistakes, and be open about where we need help. It takes vulnerability to acknowledge that we've fallen short of our values, but it's also the key to cultivating real change. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we give ourselves the chance to reconnect to others, to our purpose, and to our values. By being open about our struggles and by inviting feedback, we begin to narrow the gap between what we say we value and how we live. This is the path to more authentic, engaged, and fulfilled living. In our relationships, closing the gap might mean having difficult conversations where we share our true feelings instead of avoiding conflict. In our work, it might mean taking risks, being honest about mistakes, or pushing back against a culture that doesn't reflect the values we believe in. Whatever the case, closing the disengagement divide requires courage, vulnerability, and a commitment to living wholeheartedly. Cultivating change. In this chapter, Brené Brown reminds us that cultivating change, whether in our personal lives, in our work, or in our communities, begins with integrity. It's about aligning our words with our actions and having the courage to show up fully, even when it's uncomfortable. By embracing vulnerability, practicing accountability, and closing the disengagement divide, we can begin to live more authentically and in alignment with our deepest values. This, Brown explains, is the foundation of daring greatly. It's about living with integrity, staying engaged, and continuously striving to be the best version of ourselves, even when it's difficult. As we move forward in this journey, Brown challenges us to mind the gap, to notice where we're falling short of our values, and to take action to close that gap. It's not about being perfect, it's about being courageous enough to keep showing up, even when the road is tough. Chapter 6, Disruptive Engagement, Daring to Rehumanize Education and Work. In Chapter 6 of Daring Greatly, Brené Brown shifts the focus to how we can bring vulnerability and wholeheartedness into two critical spaces where many of us spend the majority of our lives, education and work. She calls for disruptive engagement, a bold, courageous approach to rehumanizing these environments that often leave us feeling disconnected, undervalued, and disengaged. Brown argues that many of the challenges we face in education and the workplace stem from a lack of vulnerability and a culture of scarcity, fear, and shame. But by daring to engage vulnerably and authentically, we can create spaces that foster connection, creativity, and growth for everyone involved. Rehumanizing education. First, Brown addresses the realm of education, a space where many students and educators alike feel the weight of unrealistic expectations, fear of failure, and the constant pressure to perform. Brown argues that these environments often breed disengagement, as both students and teachers armor up to protect themselves from judgment and shame. Brown explains that vulnerability in education doesn't mean showing weakness. It means creating an environment where students feel safe to express themselves, take risks, and learn from failure without fear of being shamed. She emphasizes that the most effective teachers are those who are willing to be vulnerable themselves, acknowledging their own mistakes, modeling resilience, and fostering a sense of connection in the classroom. In a culture of scarcity, many students are constantly reminded that they're not enough, not smart enough, not hardworking enough, not capable enough. This environment stifles creativity and discourages the very curiosity and engagement that education is meant to inspire. Brown shares stories from her research about how rehumanizing education starts with compassionate leadership. Educators who are willing to create spaces where students are seen, heard, and valued for who they are, not just what they achieve. This involves vulnerability from both students and educators, creating a culture of mutual respect and shared learning. By daring to engage disruptively, we can challenge the culture of perfectionism and scarcity in education, and instead foster one of empathy, connection, and wholeheartedness, an environment where students are free to learn and grow authentically. Rehumanizing work. Brown then shifts the focus to the workplace, where similar dynamics of fear, scarcity, and shame are often at play. In many organizations, vulnerability is viewed as a weakness. and employees armor up to protect themselves from criticism, judgment, or failure. This culture of fear stifles innovation, creativity, and engagement. Brown argues that vulnerability is essential for effective leadership and a thriving workplace. She describes how leaders who embrace vulnerability are able to foster trust, creativity, and collaboration among their teams, instead of pretending to have all the answers or being invulnerable to mistakes. These leaders acknowledge their own imperfections, listen openly to feedback, and create a culture where it's safe to take risks. Brown's research shows that workplaces where vulnerability is embraced are more innovative and resilient because employees feel empowered to bring their whole selves to work. When employees aren't constantly in self-protection mode, they are more engaged, creative, and willing to take risks that lead to growth and success. However, rehumanizing the workplace requires disruptive engagement, a willingness to challenge the status quo and create a culture where vulnerability, empathy, and connection are valued. This means fostering an environment where employees feel safe to speak up, ask for help, and admit when they don't know something without fear of being shamed or dismissed. Brown emphasizes that this type of culture change starts at the top. Leaders who model vulnerability create a ripple effect throughout their organizations. They demonstrate that it's okay to be imperfect, to take risks, and to learn from mistakes, creating a more humane, engaged, and innovative workplace. The role of shame in work and education. One of the key barriers to vulnerability in both education and work, Brown explains, is shame. In many schools and workplaces, shame is used as a tool for motivation, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Students are shamed for making mistakes, and employees are shamed for not meeting expectations. But shame, as Brown's research shows, is never an effective motivator. Shame shuts people down, leading to disengagement, resentment, and fear. In contrast, environments that foster empathy and accountability encourage growth, innovation, and true engagement. When people feel safe to be vulnerable, whether by admitting a mistake, sharing a new idea, or asking for help, they are more likely to take the risks that lead to learning and success. Brown argues that by removing shame from our schools and workplaces, we can cultivate spaces where people feel valued and connected, where they can contribute authentically and wholeheartedly. Disruptive engagement, a call to action. Brown closes this chapter with a powerful call to action. She urges us to embrace disruptive engagement, challenge the status quo in education and work by bringing vulnerability and wholeheartedness into these spaces. This means having the courage to engage authentically, even when it's uncomfortable, and creating environments where others feel safe to do the same. In education, disruptive engagement might look like teachers modeling vulnerability in the classroom, fostering a culture of connection and learning rather than perfectionism and fear. In the workplace, it might mean leaders being willing to admit their own mistakes, encourage open dialogue, and create a culture where empathy and creativity thrive. By daring to engage disruptively, we can rehumanize these critical spaces and create environments where people feel seen, valued, and empowered to contribute their best selves. This is what it means to dare greatly, to show up with courage and vulnerability, and to create the conditions for others to do the same. As Brown reminds us, disruptive engagement isn't easy, but it's necessary for creating workplaces and educational environments that are truly innovative, compassionate, and connected. Chapter 7, Wholehearted Parenting, Daring to be the adults we want our children to be. In the final chapter of Daring Greatly, Brené Brown takes us to the heart of one of the most important and personal areas of our lives' parenting. She invites us to explore how vulnerability and wholeheartedness can transform the way We parent and interact with our children. Rather than striving for perfection or control, Brown urges us to embrace the concept of wholehearted parenting, which means showing up with courage, empathy, and authenticity, even in the face of uncertainty and fear. Brown begins by addressing a common struggle for many parents, the fear of not being good enough. We often feel immense pressure to be perfect parents, to shield our children from pain, ensure their success, and avoid mistakes at all costs. But this perfectionist approach can be stifling, both for us and for our children. It teaches them that vulnerability is something to avoid rather than something to embrace. The role of vulnerability in parenting. Brown explains that vulnerability is essential to wholehearted parenting. Vulnerability allows us to admit when we don't have all the answers, to show our children that it's okay to make mistakes, and to model resilience in the face of failure. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable as parents, we teach our children that they too can show up authentically without fear of shame or rejection. One of the most important aspects of wholehearted parenting, according to Brown, is letting go of the idea that we need to be perfect. Instead of trying to protect our children from every possible disappointment or setback, we should focus on helping them build resilience. This means creating a safe space where they can express their feelings, learn from their mistakes, and develop the tools they need to navigate the world with courage and empathy. Brown shares that vulnerability also means being honest with our children about our own experiences, sharing our struggles, our failures, and how we've grown from them. By doing this, we show our children that they are not alone in their challenges, and that their worth is not tied to their successes or failures. This openness fosters deeper connections and helps children develop a stronger sense of self-worth. The gifts of imperfection. Brown challenges us to embrace the idea that imperfection is a gift in parenting. Perfectionism may seem like a way to protect our children, but in reality, it can create a culture of fear and unrealistic expectations. Instead of striving to be perfect parents who always have it all together, Brown encourages us to show up as real parents who are willing to admit when we're struggling, ask for help when we need it, and allow our children to see that we are human too. By embracing imperfection, we give our children the freedom to be imperfect as well. We teach them that their worth isn't determined by their achievements, but by who they are at their core. This is one of the greatest gifts we can give our children, the belief that they are enough, just as they are. Brown introduces the concept of shame resilience in the context of parenting. She explains that children who grow up in environments where vulnerability, empathy, and self-compassion are modeled are more likely to develop resilience to shame. This resilience helps them navigate the challenges of life with greater confidence and courage. Daring to be the adults we want our children to be. One of the most powerful ideas in this chapter is Brown's assertion that we must be the adults we want our children to become. If we want our children to grow up to be courageous, empathetic, and authentic, we must embody those values ourselves. Children learn not just from what we say, but from how we live. When we show up with vulnerability, embrace our imperfections, and live wholeheartedly, we give our children permission to do the same. Brown emphasizes that parenting is not about controlling outcomes. It's about creating a space where children feel loved, valued, and seen. It's about teaching them how to handle life's challenges with grace and courage, rather than shielding them from discomfort. By daring to parent from a place of vulnerability and authenticity, we help our children develop the confidence and resilience they need to thrive in an imperfect world. Wholehearted parenting is not about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about cultivating connection, fostering empathy, and encouraging our children to embrace their own vulnerability. This, Brown argues, is how we raise children who are capable of living wholeheartedly by modeling it ourselves, day by day, moment by moment, creating a culture of belonging. In this chapter, Brown also talks about the importance of creating a culture of belonging for our children. True belonging isn't about fitting in or meeting external expectations. It's about being accepted and loved for who we truly are. Brown encouraged parents to foster a sense of belonging in their homes, where children feel safe to express their true selves, even when they're struggling. By creating this culture of belonging, we help our children develop a strong sense of self-worth that isn't dependent on external validation. They learn that they are worthy of love and belonging, no matter what. This sense of security allows them to face the world with greater courage and resilience. Brown reminds us that belonging begins at home. When children know that they are accepted and loved unconditionally, they are more likely to take risks, be creative, and engage with the world in a wholehearted way. This foundation of belonging is what enables them to dare greatly in their own lives. Conclusion: wholehearted parenting. Brené Brown closes this chapter on wholehearted parenting. She reminds us that parenting is one of the most vulnerable endeavors we will ever undertake. There are no guarantees, no perfect formulas, and no way to control every outcome. But by daring to parent with vulnerability, courage, and empathy, we create the conditions for our children to grow into the wholehearted adults we hope they will become. Brown encourages us to embrace the messiness of parenting, to let go of the need to be perfect, and instead focus on being present, being real, and being loving. When we dare to parent wholeheartedly, we create a legacy of courage, compassion, and connection that will impact not only our children, but future generations as well. As we come to the end of our journey through Daring Greatly by Brené Brown, it's clear that vulnerability is not a weakness. It's a courageous and powerful act that allows us to live wholeheartedly. Whether in our relationships, work, parenting, or daily lives, daring to be vulnerable opens the door to deeper connection, greater creativity, and true fulfillment. Brown reminds us that living wholeheartedly isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, being real, and embracing the messiness of life with courage and empathy. When we choose to be vulnerable, we create space for growth, healing, and authentic connection with those around us. So as you move forward, remember, dare greatly in everything you do. Be kind to yourself, embrace your imperfections, and have the courage to show up and be seen. Life's most meaningful moments often come from the times when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Daring Greatly. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content that dives deep into personal growth, courage, and living with authenticity. I look forward to seeing you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring ideas and stories that inspire us to live more fully and fearlessly. Take care, be kind to yourself, and remember, keep daring greatly.